I thought it would be interesting to recount an unusual episode I experienced a few years ago, around Halloween time. I had recently settled into my new home in Rains Park, in southwest London, and was still getting familiar with the area. Currently, my bosses and colleagues are aware that I face a constant challenge with the unpredictability of the Southwest trains, which often affects my ability to arrive at work punctually. I hoped to overcome this obstacle by acquiring a bicycle. However, the London weather and my tendency to procrastinate combined to make me resort to trains for the daily commute. While many know that trains affect my arrival at work, few are aware of the difficulties I face in returning. I often find myself stranded at Clapham Junction station with no train options to Rains Park. On such occasions, I opt for the bus to Wembley Common and walk the rest of the way, which is actually quite pleasant. London is not known for its hills, so while walking along a street, I am sometimes treated to charming views. Describing Wimbledon Village as an affluent area is an understatement. The entrances of residences display sports cars and luxury SUVs, suggesting that my nighttime walks are quite peaceful. I rarely encounter anyone, except perhaps an elderly couple returning from dinner, or someone walking their dog. The neighborhood is quiet, and its residents tend to retire early, and that night was no different. Initially, I got off the bus at the War Memorial, crossed the village center, and headed down Ridgeway. My phone died between Wandsworth and South Fields, so I continued without music, which made the journey longer. I usually take the opportunity to observe the houses, satisfying my curiosity. That night, while lost in my thoughts, I decided to light a cigarette and stopped to look for my lighter. That's when I realized I wasn't alone on the street. This was unusual but not worrisome. What caught my attention was that the other person didn't fit the usual profile of residents. It was a young woman, looking either drunk or exhausted. I lit my cigarette and hesitated for a moment, wondering if she would manage to get home on her own or if she needed help. That's when I noticed her tears. I approached to check if everything was okay. She stopped and stood still. She was wearing a Halloween costume, a schoolgirl outfit, and as I got closer, I realized she was very young, maybe 15 or 16. Her paleness was noticeable, and her makeup seemed professional or the result of extensive preparation. I thought maybe she had argued with friends about her costume and left a party, drunk and upset. I felt uneasy as I noticed her staring at me. In a metropolis like London, there's an unwritten rule to avoid eye contact with strangers. I deduced that she might be under the influence of something stronger than alcohol and decided to be cautious. I kept a safe distance and asked, "Are you okay? You seem upset. Do you need help?" She didn't respond, just stared at me with those piercing eyes. "Have you had too much to drink? Or maybe smoke something?" Yeah, I recognized the effects of hallucinogens. Still, she remained silent. "Do you need a taxi? Do you remember where you live?" Her tears turned into deep sobs, and I could feel the desperation emanating from her. Somehow she heard me as she began to recompose herself from the brink of a nervous breakdown. Still sobbing, she looked up at me and whispered softly, "Because you're going to die." I was confused, not understanding the reason behind her words. Perhaps she had recently lost someone dear to her. I wanted to reassure her, to say that everything would be okay, and that death is just a part of life. But all I managed to say was a bewildered, "I know." This seemed to surprise her, almost irritate her. She retorted, "You're going to die, and he's going to kill you." Alarms rang in my mind. I began to feel threatened. I decided it was no longer my responsibility to calm her from her bad trip. "Good luck," I said, and turned to walk away. After a few steps, I looked back and saw her still standing there, lowering her head and starting to sob again. I quickened my pace, and soon the bend in the road took her out of my sight. I was uneasy. I put on my headphones, trying to listen to music on my phone, only to remember that it was out of battery. There were still 2 kilometers to go home, but at my pace, I was confident I would arrive in less than 20 minutes. That's when I heard the screams. A man's voice, full of malice and anger. "I'm coming after you." I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it sounded distant, perhaps from where the girl was. I realized it could be a Halloween prank, but I didn't slow down. I thought I should be scared and run, but I was determined not to give in to fear. He shouted again, and this time it was closer. "I hate you." The voice now seemed to come from somewhere behind me. I expected to see the man shouting, but the street was still empty. I was walking fast, so he must have been running, but I didn't hear footsteps. There were more than one Joker, and they had several hiding spots. I decided to leave the main road and entered Thornton Road by the Swan Pub. The prank had affected me, and I didn't want to see what else they had planned. I reached the front of the second house when I heard the terrible voice again. "You're going to die." This time, it seemed to come from the street entrance. Perhaps a last attempt to scare me before I disappeared into the darkness. The streets were darker, but I decided not to run. Everything seemed to be a joke, but the intensity of the screams worried me. I could be dealing with a maniac. It would be interesting to be the target of an elaborate prank, but the voice conveyed genuine hatred. I didn't want to encounter whoever it was. I had already reached the turning point where Thornton Road merges with itself, when suddenly I heard a scream, "I'm gonna end you." This time, the sound clearly came from my right side. The aggressor must have been hidden behind a residential wall or, who knows, lurking from inside one of the houses. It was evident that I had stumbled into their ambush. That's when I started to run. At that moment, terror took hold of me. My brain betrayed me with frightening illusions, and the voices seemed to surround me, screaming incessantly. Suddenly, I stopped running, and a vehicle sped past the stretch that I would have crossed if I hadn't stopped at that precise moment, narrowly avoiding being hit. The individual responsible for the threats had disappeared. I lit a cigarette and took a few moments to regain my composure. I headed home and nothing else happened, but while I was there trying to compose myself between panic and adrenaline, I thought I heard a delicate murmur. It may have been just my imagination, but it sounded like the soft voice of a girl whispering, "Next time, you won't get away." This happened in my childhood, when I was about 9 years old, approximately 2 decades ago. Halloween was one of my most anticipated holidays. I loved going out with friends, dressing up in funny costumes, and going out to collect lots of candy. That particular year, I vividly remember my friend eagerly coming to my house to trick-or-treat with me. Additionally, he planned to spend the night there. After all, I lived only with my mother, as my older sister was at her best friend's house. We went out for trick-or-treating around 6 p.m., with our empty bags eager to be filled with delicious sweets. I would describe the neighborhood I lived in as quite typical, with several other houses on the same street in a large residential area. My street was usually very quiet, but on Halloween, it came alive with the energy of excited children from the entire neighborhood, participating in the trick-or-treat ritual. My friend and I visited every house on our street, and then moved on to the next one, spending hours until our bags were so full that we could barely carry them. It must have been around 9 p.m. when we decided to head back home, exhausted, but satisfied with our sweet haul. As we returned indoors, we began carefully examining all the candy we had collected. It didn't take long for my mother to go to bed, confident that we would be safe at home. Since we didn't have school the next day, we planned to stay up all night, enjoying playing video games in the living room. I vividly remember settling onto the couch, turning on the PlayStation 2, and diving into our favorite multiplayer games. We spent hours immersed in our games, but our fun was suddenly interrupted when the doorbell rang around 11 p.m. Although it was late for Halloween visits, we assumed it was another child looking for candy or tricks. Sean and I exchanged surprised glances, wondering who could be out so late at night. Peering through the living room window, our hearts raced as we spotted a strange man outside, standing on the front step. He wasn't wearing any costume, and his presence made us uncomfortable. With our hearts pounding, we quickly closed the curtains, hoping the man hadn't seen us. The doorbell rang again, increasing our anxiety. Sean and I hesitated, wondering if we should answer the door or simply ignore it. After a moment of silence, we risked peeking through the window again, only to find the man staring directly into the house. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized he was watching us. Without a second thought, we ran to the bedroom and locked the door behind us, seeking refuge in the safest place we could find. Our fear grew even more when we heard the sound of breaking glass from below, indicating that the intruder had invaded our home. Sean and I clung to each other, desperately waiting for the police to arrive as we hid in my mother's room. After an agonizing wait, we heard the comforting sounds of police sirens approaching. With relief, we emerged from the closet and joined my mother as the police searched our home for the intruder. Although he had left before the police arrived, The man left behind a trail of destruction and theft in his wake. We were grateful that we were all safe, but fear and uncertainty lingered in our hearts for the rest of the night, marking that Halloween as the scariest of all time. I was 27 years old and was at a Halloween-themed party at the residence of my former best friend Dylan, who passed away a few years ago due to an overdose. Before his passing, he used to host large Halloween celebrations at his house, taking advantage of his parents' travels during that time of year. Dylan was passionate about Halloween, so his house was always filled with high-quality spooky decorations that he invested a lot in. He even built a scary maze inside the house, with walls made of cardboard covered with appropriate wallpaper. I'll avoid detailing the drugs, drinks, and other excesses that occurred at these parties, focusing on the events that unfolded when things took a dark turn. All of us, including Dylan and some other friends, were in his upstairs bedroom, enjoying a relaxing moment, when we heard loud and continuous knocks coming from downstairs. Dylan, visibly nervous, went to check what was happening. Screams, both male and female, echoed throughout the house, indicating that something terrible was happening downstairs. Instinctively, we asked Dylan to close the door and come back to the room. Aware of the imminent danger, Dylan hurried back and locked the door behind him, with a shocked expression on his face. We all begged for answers, but he instructed us to hide without explanation. Understanding the gravity of the situation, we obeyed. Dylan turned off the lights and hid in the closet with a friend, while me and another friend hid under the bed. We heard noises downstairs, including the music being turned off, and authoritative voices. Tension escalated as we realized there were intruders in the house. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching our room made our hearts race. The intruders attempted to break down the door, and after some agonizing moments, they succeeded in entering. We witnessed terrifying scenes as one of the intruders confronted Dylan, demanding him to come downstairs. We listened to the negotiations in silence, unable to clearly understand what was being said. It seemed like an eternity before the intruders finally left, leaving us in shock and relief. As we descended the stairs, the scene that unfolded before us was devastating. Two of our friends lay on the ground, lifeless, their heads wounded by gunshots, a horrifying glimpse of what transpired on that fateful night. On a Halloween night, my parents went out with my two twin siblings for trick-or-treating, leaving me at home with not much planned. I ended up being tasked with answering the door and handing out candies, since we lived in a cul-de-sac and received few visitors on that chilly night. Every doorbell ring made me jump, and I found myself in the living room watching TV with a bucket of candies beside me on a small table, where Butterfingers rested, the only treat my mom always bought for Halloween, for some reason. When the doorbell rang, I grabbed the orange bucket and went to the door. I encountered a person wearing a scream mask and a cloak, holding a pillowcase. It seemed like they hadn't gotten many treats on that lonely night. Although they didn't say thanks, I generously gave them some candies before closing the door. Back on the couch, my mind occupied by what had happened, I flipped through TV channels after the movie I was watching ended. During a moment of silence, I heard a thud coming from the back door area. I lowered the TV volume and went to the stairs, where I noticed the back door wide open. My heart started racing as I realized I had forgotten to lock it when I left. Uncertainty gripped me as I questioned whether the sound I heard was the door opening or closing, and if someone was inside the house. I called out for my parents and siblings, but the silence in the dark sent shivers down my spine. With no door separating the main floor from the staircase, staying in the living room didn't feel safe. I left the TV on, but muted, seeking some comfort in the extra light. It took me a while to decide to call my parents and ask them to come home. My mom tried to reassure me, saying it was just my imagination, but my fear heightened when I heard suspicious sounds coming from the stairs. I froze on the couch, unable to move, until I heard another creak. I got up silently, trembling with fear, and ran to my room, locking the door until my parents arrived. When they finally returned, we thoroughly searched the house, checking every nook and cranny. Fortunately, we didn't find anyone, but the memory of fear lingered. The moral of the story is simple. Always keep your doors locked, for you never know what might happen. On Halloween night in 2008, me and my three friends, whom I'll call Johnny, Kevin, and Larry respectively, were roaming the downtown area in search of candies. As usual, the downtown was packed that night, with houses close to each other, which meant more candies with every step we took. By 10 o'clock, the hustle and bustle began to die down, and by 10:30, we were the only kids still out on the street. With few houses open, we gave up on trick-or-treating and decided to just goof around. After all, it was Saturday night. As we played, we spotted a lone figure dressed as a clown slowly approaching from the mist in the distance. Their costume was impressive, with scary makeup and bloody wounds. We laughed and screamed but decided to move on. We headed to a nearby park to mess around, play with party foam and shaving cream, but found party foam strings scattered across the playground and shaving cream staining the walls of the park restroom. As we had fun, Johnny pointed to the dark horizon, where two clowns were slowly approaching our way, one of them the same we had seen before. The second clown looked even more unsettling. As they drew closer, initial fear gave way to curiosity. Then, the clowns began to chase us, and we ran in different directions. One of the clowns followed me out of the park and down the street. I ran as fast as I could to Ellis's house, where I called him and said I was in his backyard. He too had been chased, said he was on his way. I quickly talked to Johnny and Kevin, who were safe, and we agreed to meet at Ellis's house. When we reunited, we laughed about the ordeal as we ate the candies we managed to get. After Kevin went home, the three of us stayed in the living room, playing Xbox, until Johnny noticed something through the window and asked us to turn off the TV. When we looked out the window, we saw a clown standing outside Ellis's house, staring directly at us. We closed the curtains and went up to her room, where, despite the scare, we managed to relax. The next morning, Larry found a rubber clown nose on his patio table, left there to spook us. Fortunately, the clown epidemic didn't last more than a month, and the experience became just an old story.